right, people. We're going to try to get the evening underway. I'm sorry to interrupt all the conversations at your tables, but I'm hoping that we have at least as interesting a presentation and program for you this evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Beddoes, and I'm proud to be the Interim Dean of the Faculty of Architecture. And it is my pleasure this evening to welcome you to the Russell Building, to Homecoming 2016, and the kickoff to a full year celebration to recognize the 50th anniversary of the environmental science and environmental design programs in this faculty. Here at the I agree, 50 years is worth at least one round of applause. As you know, here at the University of Manitoba, there are more than 2,000 students that identify as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, and the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The University of Manitoba is committed to a renewed relationship and dialogue with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples based on the principles of mutual trust, respect, and reciprocity. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The University of Manitoba is committed to ensuring that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit knowledge, cultures, and traditions are embraced and reflected in the pursuit of its mission. So given that this is the significant 50th anniversary milestone of the environmental science and environmental design programs, let me take just a few minutes to share just a little bit of history of this program. So if you can just hit that. There we go. And so there on one slide is the 100-year history of our faculty, and in particular the 50 years of our environmental science and environmental design program. So 50 years, everybody can do the arithmetic. The environmental science program started in 1966, just over 50 years after the architecture programs were introduced at the University of Manitoba. A primary driving force behind the introduction of the program was to present a curriculum and pedagogy that would address the increasingly complex issues faced by designers with full recognition of the environmental consequences of design and planning decisions. Dean John Russell and Carl Nelson were instrumental in the design and preparations of this new program, but unfortunately John Russell passed away in 1966, but is remembered on a daily basis as we come into this building, the Russell Building. And we now have a Carl R. Nelson Jr. Teaching Award in honor of his contribution to the faculty. The program, I think, was a very timely response to many of the social, political, and industrial concerns that developed during the post-war period, with a seemingly increasing influence of consumerism and the concomitant environmental issues. Among other factors, urban smog, realization of polluted rivers and lakes and air, the trend to suburbanism in the 50s and 60s, and the slow death of urban centers. All these cried out for a new approach to design and planning education, and the University of Manitoba took a pioneering role in introducing an innovative program. The program forced students to carefully consider issues associated with materials consumerism, energy use, and the interface with cultural heritage. The first few graduating classes got lots to think about as a result of world issues around them, and these multiplied quickly as a result of the so-called OPEC crises of the early 70s and the political and economic changes that this brought into the late 70s and early 80s. And these events likely contributed to the strong demand for the program in the late 70s and 80s. So you can see the squiggly line in the middle of our screen here is the number of degrees granted, and that gives you an idea as to the number of students in the program, and certainly late 70s and 80s, this was a place to be. So influential has been the introduction to the environmental sciences program that it became a prerequisite for the Bachelor of Architecture and the Bachelor of Landscape Architecture programs, both of which soon after transitioned to master's program. Carl Nelson served as the environmental sciences head for the first 10 years and was followed by Rory Fonskella in 1977, who served in this capacity to 1989, except for 1 year. At the end of the 80s and into the early 90s, the program went through a significant change that included changing the name from environmental science to environmental design. And this was not just a name change, but an introduction of an entirely new program, which much of this transition overseen by Ian MacDonald, who was the head from 89 to 94. Through the 90s, with the leadership of Harlan Thompson, Mary Ellen Tyler, and Charlie Thompson, the program continued to evolve and strengthen. And in 1998, the Environmental Design program became the undergraduate foundation for the entire suite of master's programs that we offer today. With adept's leadership from 2006 to 2009, the program was again strengthened into a program of well-defined foundation years and intermediate studies, or the option years as we often refer to them. And he is really the father of the program structure that we have continued to offer. For 6.5 years to the end of last year, the program was led by Marcella Eaton, including an external review that had not been undertaken for several decades and is now influencing the future development of the program. Since the beginning of this year, I've enjoyed working with Karen Wilson-Baptist as the program chair for environmental design and associate dean, and already with Karen's leadership, the preliminary year or ED1 courses have been reviewed and refined for introduction next fall. So the evolution of the program will continue with the aim of ensuring the program remains as timely and as relevant now as it was when it was introduced 50 years ago. So that gets us today and 3,016 graduates from environmental science and environmental design programs whose names all make up the background to this slide. So you can come and find your name amongst the 3,016 names on those two slides. Come and find you. I honestly hope we didn't miss anybody. I hope you don't count and find out that there's 3,016. So, many people have contributed to making this evening a reality. This all started last winter with Marcella Eaton, Ed App, Herb Enns, Jae Sung Chung, Kim Weiss, and Alyssa Schwan, who put together a list of amazing graduates from which we invited the speakers for this celebratory year. Thanks also to Scott Barman and the current ED2 students whose work is being displayed in the front foyer from their most recent Urban Media Lab. And years ago, there was a second-year sketch camp that I'm sure many of you might remember, and thanks to Stan Britton and Andrew Little, the slides for the sketch camp, the B-Art Sketch Camp at 50 reunion, for bringing these slides to us to enjoy this evening. While you're here, I encourage you to visit the Architecture 2 Gallery and the current exhibit named Model Homes 2016. This exhibition, curated by Sean Radford and Ken Borton, includes work by local design offices that have a total of 65 employees, of whom more than 90% are graduates from this program. This exhibit is a great example of the ingenuity and design prowess of our graduates. We're attempting to put together a list of all the senior sticks through the years, and you might have noticed in the foyer there's a list with each of the years. So if you remember your senior stick, or maybe if you were the senior stick, please let us know, put the names on the listing out in the foyer so we can ensure that we have this element of our history up to date and ready for the next 50 years. An important aspect of this celebration of 50 years is the launch of an Environmental Design 50th Anniversary Scholarship. On your table, you'll find donor cards. Please help us to grow that scholarship fund. Complete the card and leave it in the box at the reception table. Your support will be appreciated by all of our future students. And just a couple of last important items. The Student Architectural Society will be hosting a mid-century ball following the event tonight, and that ball is in the hub here on campus in the University Center. Tickets are available at the drink ticket table. It'll be a great chance to meet some of the students that are in our program now and find out how their studies are the same or different from what you might have done. And finally, over the next several months, we have a series of guest speakers coming to help us celebrate this 50th year, with each speaker representing one decade of the program. The next event will be on October 18th, at which Alan Bell, a graduate from 1982, will be the guest speaker. So mark this date on your calendar. I'd love to see all of you here again, and bring your friends. Of course, the biggest thank you this evening goes to all the past and the present students whose creativity, thirst for knowledge, and enthusiasm is what keeps this faculty moving forward. So, with all of that, I'm now pleased to hand over the podium to Associate Dean Dr. Karen Wilson-Baptist to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker in our 50th anniversary celebration, Diarmuid Nash, who has been editing my talk as we've been sitting here, so I hope there's something left here. Diarmuid Nash has worked for over 25 years with Moriyama and Teshima architects. He joined the firm in 1988 after completing work on the Canadian Embassy in Tokyo, a design-build project. A partner with the firm since 1998, Diarmuid is renowned for his skilled and adept management of complex, aggressive, fast-track construction management and guaranteed maximum price projects that must address the often divergent priorities of unique user and interest groups, and delivering award-winning buildings on time with a capital T and budget with a capital B. Diarmuid was partner in charge of the 2008 Governor General award-winning new Canadian War Museum in Ottawa and the multi-phase Queenston Plaza border crossing development. Diarmuid also led the Aga Khan Museum project in Toronto as the architect of record and the design of the new Surrey City Hall project in British Columbia. And he's also written other things down here, but I can't read his writing. Currently, he is leading the MTA team on the new Windsor City Hall and the Union Museum in the United Arab Emirates. Diarmuid brings unique vision and an unparalleled depth of understanding about what creates enduring landmark places that compel people to visit again and again. Born in Galloway, Ireland, and raised in Winnipeg, Diarmuid Nash holds 2 University of Manitoba degrees, a Master of Architecture, and a Bachelor of Environmental Sciences that he received in 1974. He is past president of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and holds an adjunct associate professorship at the University of Toronto's John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. We are grateful to the Seagram's Visiting Lecture Fund for supporting tonight's lecture. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished graduate, Diarmuid Nash.
Thank you, Dr. Baptist. It's Moriyama Teshima, but we'll get that the Japanese pronunciation. I'd like to also thank the university for asking me to lecture this evening, or to talk about the theme that they gave me was to talk about what was it in environmental design that helped me prepare, or helped we as graduates prepare for life, or whatever the kind of events as our careers unfolded as we left the faculty and kind of went out into the world. So I'm not sure I could actually answer that with any great kind of insight, but what I would like to do today is perhaps talk about a project that I spent quite a bit of time on, that I know our office was engaged in for almost 10 years, a project that we worked on with some extraordinary architects, an extraordinary client, and quite an extraordinary community of Muslims. And the reason why I chose this particular project to discuss is it's really kind of appropriate in terms of where the world is today. in terms of how we communicate with one another, or how we're not communicating with one another, or how we are, the kinds of issues and political problems that we see surrounding us sort of globally, worldwide, and how, in a way, we're not listening to each other much anymore. And I think one of the kind of key and inspiring aspects of these projects was that they were designed, and they were designed to be transformational projects. They were designed to provide a bridge and a portal to kind of help increase understanding between the Islamic world and the Western world. And that was the result of kind of the extraordinary vision of the Aga Khan, the Ismaili community, and some of the architects that worked on the projects for them. So the projects that I want to talk about today are the Winford Park. We called it the Winford Park Toronto projects. There are really three specific projects: the Ismaili Center, the Aga Khan Park, and the Aga Khan Museum. But before I actually get into that in a big way, I think it's important to actually stop and think about, I'll talk a bit about how the Ismaili Muslims arrived in Canada. I'll talk a bit about the vision of the Aga Khan, who was the sort of proponent behind this extraordinary kind of group of buildings. And I'll talk a bit about the Aga Khan Foundation Network and the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, because there's a kind of a connection between all of those and the kind of work that's emerged on this site. But coincidentally, this story actually starts in 1972, when some of us were actually here as students. And so I thought that would be a good place to start. 1972 for many of us, I mean, that was a big win with when Canada won, I guess, Game 8 of the Hockey Summit, the 1972 World Events, where I guess Paul Henderson scored the winning goal. And it was as much, at that particular time, it was as much about hockey as it was about politics, about our way versus their way, and you know, sort of the East versus the West. So even though it was about hockey, it was also, there was that kind of other agenda that was played out at that time. But there was also a fair bit of conflict, both sectarian and military, in the world. There was the Christmas bombings in North Vietnam, with the President Nixon trying to negotiate a withdrawal from Vietnam. And when the North Vietnamese walked away, they initiated this sort of 2-month bombing campaign to encourage the North Vietnamese back to the table. A tremendous number of people were lost. This was sort of one of the dominating news items of the day. There was also the 1972 World Events in the Olympics, the Munich Olympics, Fry Otto's extraordinary kind of structures, but there was this tragedy with the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Palestinians and the Israelis being held hostage, with sort of 15 people being killed at the end with a botched rescue attempt. In Northern Ireland, there was a kind of a breakdown of kind of civil society, with the IRA representing the Catholics, the Ulster Development Forces sort of leeching out and kind of making it almost impossible to govern. So the British government decided to prorogue the Northern Ireland government and actually took over the operations of the country, which in fact kind of increased the sectarian conflict rather than decrease it. But also in Uganda, Idi Amin declared sort of economic war against Asians, South Asians, and passed a series of policies that basically expropriated their businesses, gave them 3 months to leave. And there were about 80,000 Asians in Uganda, many of them who had built up businesses that had been there since the 1800s. They built businesses. They were a major part of the economy of Uganda, but at the time they were asked to leave. They had 3 months. And this is really where the story begins for Canada, in a way, because many of the Ismaili Muslims in Uganda came to Canada. And they came to Canada as a result of His Highness the Aga Khan and his connections with Pierre Trudeau, negotiating a kind of an open door so that the Ismailis could come and resettle in Canada. Many settled in Toronto, many settled in Vancouver, and today they have an extraordinary kind of legacy in Canada, but also worldwide. So obviously there's a strong connection between Justin Trudeau and His Highness the Aga Khan as well. So I thought this is really the reason this sort of brought a group of people to our country. This brought the Ismaili Muslims. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ismailis, and I'm going to talk a bit about the Aga Khan. Again, more to set the platform for what we're going to talk about today. So His Highness the Aga Khan and the Ismaili Muslims. And I'll refer to my notes because I always kind of get some of this mixed up when I start to talk about so who are the Ismaili Muslims? So around the world there are approximately 15 million Ismaili Muslims who belong to the Shia branch of Islam. They're located in more than 25 countries across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and North America. The Ismailis are unique in that throughout history they are the only Shia community led by a living hereditary imam in direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad. And his hereditary title is the Aga Khan. As imam, the Aga Khan is responsible not only for interpreting the faith to the Ismaili Muslims, but also looking after the material well-being of his followers as well, which means helping improve the quality of life of the community and societies where they live, encouraging peace and promoting religious understanding. He's the founder and chairman of the Aga Khan Foundation Network. Well, the network operates around the world. It focuses on the poorest regions of Africa and Asia with the fundamental mission to fight poverty, changing the basics of the quality of life and replacing despair with hope. It's one of the largest sort of international organizations, I think, in the world. They employ about 80,000 people. They work very closely with national governments, with private sector and multilateral organizations. A significant portion of Ismaili community members contribute substantial volunteer time, professional services, and financial resources to these endeavors. The work has always been people-driven, with a simple mandate to relieve disease, deprivation, and ignorance for the people they serve, no matter their faith. The Aga Khan Development Network builds colleges, schools, hospitals, power plants, housing projects that benefit the people of all faiths in some of the poorest regions. They're currently actually working on the Global Center for Pluralism. I think they're working on that with KPMG architects in Ottawa. And the Global Center for Pluralism is really a sort of a way of thinking about how we live with others in the world. It's a way of thinking about embracing the human differences, reconciling what is unique with us, with what universally connects us, and promoting the world's variety as a blessing rather than as a burden, which it obviously there's lots of examples of that particular interpretation. The Aga Khan believes that architecture is one of those forces that have transformational potential to the buildings in which we spend so many days and nights of our lives. He believes architecture embraces practically all aspects of our built environment, including urbanization, water management, air pollution, protection from man-made natural hazards, and the efficient use of limited resources. His dedication to architecture is best exemplified not only in the work, the projects they build, the architects that they hire, but his dedication to architecture is best exemplified in the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, which has more to do with improving conditions of humanity than it does with heralding new architectural styles. The award aims to identify architectural projects that successfully address the needs and aspirations of Islamic societies in the fields of contemporary design, social housing, community development, and improvement of the environment. So it recognizes in the award the contribution of the teams, the users, and the projects themselves. So I'll just sort of make one comment that when the Ismailis were in the process of being expelled from Uganda, they met with amongst themselves. They met with the Aga Khan and other leaders in the community. And there was at the time a unanimity that wherever they would settle, they would build new spaces for gathering of the communities and for the practice of their faith in the countries that were welcoming them. These new buildings were to be called Ismaili centers. And they had to reflect the Ismaili aspirations for the future rather than the tragedies of the past. And these would be places where other communities would be received in a dignified manner and where common grounds could be found between groups that sometimes badly misunderstand each other. So that's the background to our client, the community that we've worked with for almost 10 years, actually longer, as we worked on another project prior to that. And some of the architects that we worked with, many of whom have been working on these projects, I would say, for Charles Correa, for example, was working for 16 years, I think, on the Ismaili Center in Toronto. But just a little bit about the site. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you through the buildings on the site, talk a bit about their design, talk a bit about the aspirations. I was heavily engaged in the Aga Khan Museum. I'll talk a bit about Moriyama Teshima's role as the kind of executive architect of the entire, of all of the projects, as sort of we started to see ourselves as kind of the operating system, the platform or whatever that could kind of manage Charles Correa, Fumika Maki, and Vladimir Jervich, Adrian Gader, and Ariz Hazam, some of the players and designers, the engineers that were engaged in the project, and how we as a firm actually embraced that. We relished it. I think partially because Raymond and Ted came from an environment where they themselves had come from, had been kind of stripped of their citizenship, put into camps, and received that as they grew, and they came from it with a kind of an understanding and a belief that these projects were in fact quite important, and that we should actually become a part of that kind of process that was being developed. The site is it's up the Don Valley Parkway, so this is the City of Toronto, so our office is down here someplace, but the site is up on the Don Valley Parkway, sort of on the northeast side of Toronto, on a quadrant at the interchange of the Don Valley Parkway and Eglinton Avenue. It's located in an area where it has a number of sort of cultural facilities. The Ontario Science Centre is located close by. Here, the first Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, this is a project that Raymond did, I think, when he was one of the very first commissions, the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, which is now an Islamic Cultural Center called the Noor Cultural Center, which we also worked with the Noor community in sort of regenerating the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center as the Noor Cultural Center. And then the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center came over to this quadrant here, and Bruce Kuwabara, KPMB, worked on that new facility, which was larger than the old facility. And the Wintford Park, the three projects that we're going to look at today, or this evening, are these three projects: the Ismaili Center, the Aga Khan Park, and the Aga Khan Museum. Just a close-up. Actually, the impact of this facility has generated a fair bit of development around this area at the same time. This is an older image, but this is Eglinton Avenue East, and this is the Don Valley Parkway going north-south. So this is Eglinton Avenue going east. And this is about a 7-hectare site. There was most of the buildings had been removed, with the exception of one, which was, some more views of it. There was a competition actually in the year 2000, which is the very first time we met Charles Correa. The competition was for the first Ismaili Center. There's an Ismaili Center that Bruno Freschke had designed in Vancouver, and then there was a competition for the Ismaili Center in Toronto. Moriyama Teshima were asked to participate in that competition along with Charles Correa and Arcop, I think, at the time. And that was the very first time we met Charles. We were just kind of like, my personal opinion, he's an incredible individual. But anyway, we didn't win that competition. Charles did, and probably kind of happy that he did. So it was a good experience. The original competition was to be located here. This is the site before they started to kind of excavate. Actually, this is a site in the year about 2004, just when we were being commissioned to work with Fumiko Maki. We were asked to work with Charles Correa, and we were asked to work with an unknown designer who was going to do the park, the Aga Khan Park. So the condition was that we would coordinate all three of the designers, plus the other designers that would be engaged in exhibitions and interior design and some of the other aspects of the project. So after a long discussion in the office, I mean, we'd worked with Fumiko Maki on one project, and we just really enjoyed that experience both professionally and personally. Felt it was an extraordinary office, very an incredible group of talented architects, very passionate about their work. And we thought it would be wonderful to try and find another circumstance where we could work together. At the time, the Aga Khan Museum was scheduled to be located in London, but at the time, as we were finishing off the delegation building in Ottawa with Fumiko Maki, the Aga Khan decided to move the Aga Khan Museum to Toronto, and that this would become a kind of a complex of both the Ismaili Center, the museum, and a park. And it would be kind of sort of an oasis in the city, which was the kind of original thinking process to the project, for the project. There was one actually modernist building on the site, which was this building, which is the Bata Shoe Museum. Sorry, it's the Bata building. It was the Bata headquarters. And it was actually interesting because this building was, there was quite a pushback because this was a building of great significance. It was a company that had come to Canada and created this incredible kind of recognition for their product. There was one of the early kind of international global companies working around the world. Thomas Bata and Sonia Bata, I think, worked here pretty much every day. Sonia Bata, we'd worked with Sonia Bata on the Bata Shoe Museum, and Sonia Bata was an architect. She's a great storyteller too. She knew Corbu, she knew like all these incredible people, and if you just wanted to sit and listen to her, she was really quite wonderful and generous in her kind of reminiscence. So the Bata building was on the site. There was actually kind of a series of studies that was undertaken, kind of heritage studies of looking at initially trying to find a place that the complex could kind of work with the other buildings, with the kind of the park. There was a community meeting. There was a sort of a large community meeting, and Sonia Bata actually came to the meeting and spoke in favor of actually saying that it was really time now for kind of sort of some new architecture. It was time for Charles Correa and Fumiko Maki to put their projects here, and in a way that sort of settled the issue, and the project moved on. So this is the site. The first master plan for the site was Maki did the first master plan for the site, where they started to site the major buildings. In the original kind of the original Ismaili Center competition, the Ismaili Center was to be located over here, but after they acquired the entire site, the way the site sort of sits on a high rise and steps down. I'll show you some model images, but it steps down towards Eglinton Avenue, and there's this incredible view of going up the Don Valley Parkway. As you drive up the Don Valley Parkway, as if you drive across the base here, you see these kind of buildings kind of perched up on the rise of this particular site. So there was a desire to have the Ismaili Center located in this spot here, where the prayer hall would become the most prominent piece of the site, and that everything else in terms of size and scale would be would kind of respect that particular kind of form and shape. There was a series of studies that were done that looked at sort of conceptually how to approach the three projects, whether there would be sort of three distinct zones of the Ismaili Center, the an Islamic garden for the museum, or whether it be two zones where really the garden and the museum would be kind of intertwined in a way, because the kind of cultural and architectural and landscape traditions could be kind of fused together as kind of part of what the museum was kind of communicating about Islamic art and architecture. And then the third one was to actually treat the garden as the kind of linking element between both the Ismaili Center and the museum. There's a series of principles that were advanced at that time. So this was 2005, yeah. So there was a sort of a unification of the site using landscape to unify the site, extending a boss. There was the site was also very noisy because of the Don Valley Parkway. So there's a fair bit of noise, a lot of traffic along here. And so there was a desire to actually create some ways to soften the impact of noise, and berms, the introduction of berms, or providing a kind of southern edge that could somehow kind of soften the impact of noise. The landscaping along that southern edge, on this edge, became quite important. So there's a series of studies as to how best to mitigate this kind of noise that was coming off the highway. And then the planning department, the City of Toronto, was also engaged at this point, and they were really kind of concerned that there was this sort of these buildings in the park that were kind of counter to the way they were thinking of an urban kind of project, particularly in this part of the city where there's a lot of buildings in the park. There's a lot of buildings that are stepped back from the streets. And so they were sort of pushing, sort of encouraging that there be a kind of a way to create a strong edge along Winford Drive here. And that became a kind of a landscape solution to try and create a kind of an alley of trees that could kind of create this kind of solid edge along that. And this was also before there was a competition that was being set up simultaneous to this 2005 massing sort of kind of master plan. There was a competition to actually select a landscape architect that could actually design this zone and the rest of the site, but this zone being the most important part of the linking element between the two buildings. So there was this sense of how do you enter the buildings? I mean, you can see there is that the buildings, both the museum and the Ismaili Center, have these kind of strong kind of porte cocheres that kind of reach out towards Winford Drive, making a strong connection to the street. There's also this connection east and west between them at the same time, and the idea of trying to densify this area and kind of free up the space of this area. There was a lot of kind of there was quite a bit of study, meeting with Islamic landscape scholars around how to best design this area, and the notion of a kind of a reinterpreting a charbagh, sort of the traditional Islamic garden, to reinterpret that in a way that would be contemporary, North American, began to emerge as a way to think about this space. At that time, there was a landscape architecture competition. 15 firms were invited to submit. I think 3 or 4 made it to the next level, and ultimately presented designs to become the landscape architects for the Aga Khan Park, but also for the entire Winford site. These are some of the original kind of model studies that were done to kind of look at the kind of massing on site. You can see this is actually the prayer hall of the Ismaili Center. That's the museum over here. The prayer hall really dominates. This is really the view as you're driving up the Don Valley Parkway. So it's a very dominant cluster of buildings as you kind of move up north, the north part, driving north. Again, sort of the kind of notion of creating strong edges. And then some of Professor Maki's original kind of sketches of what this garden could look like and what the view of the museum would be from the Ismaili Center. Some more detailed images of what that charbagh, what those 4 components of the charbagh would be. Some scale studies of just the size. The size was about 50 meters by 75 meters, so there was a series of scale studies to get a sense of the spacing and the space between the buildings. And then there was the competition, and the competition, Vladimir Jervich won the competition. Not many people knew Vladimir Jervich. He had won an Aga Khan award, and that's the way the story is told. Somebody that was putting this together saw this and convinced the Aga Khan that he should be also selected to submit. He had a firm of about 15 in Brumana, which overlooks Beirut. He's from Beirut. He left Beirut during the Civil War, trained as a landscape architect, came back to Beirut after the Syrians left, and there was kind of a peace accord was reached, and he rebuilt his practice. So he came with, I remember listening to his presentation, he just crushed the competition. Like, he was so passionate about this project, and the drawings he did were just kind of, I don't know, all the other competitors could not match. He was so obviously the person to select for the job. It was incredible, because you just realize how, as designers and architects, that, you know, if you can actually do so much just with your beliefs and passions and the kind of skills and language and communication skills and drawing skills, given the right opportunities to kind of win commissions like this. So Vladimir Jervich was appointed the landscape architect for the park, and because nobody really knew who he was, a group of us went to Beirut and we met his clients who were like, couldn't say enough about him. He has quite a beautiful office overlooking the city, and he began this kind of journey of designing the park. So I'll just take you into the park a bit, because that's the sort of linking element. When he won the competition, the Aga Khan sent him on a world tour to look at Islamic gardens. So obviously these are some of the key ones. Humayun's tomb, I think Alhambra, and I think it was on like a 4-week tour of looking at some of the kind of major kind of Islamic gardens throughout the world. He actually looked very closely at the 4-part charbagh and came back with, and of course was inspired by the landscape, the Persian paintings of landscape, depictions of landscape, but came back with a vision that was one that would capture the essence of the Islamic garden and translate that then into an expression that would reflect its context and contemporary age. So he came back with not 4, but 5 components, water components. So this is really the central part of the park. There's 5 ponds that sort of link these elements and create this kind of view corridor. There's a dense planting along the south edge to create a buffer, and then there was this sort of alley of trees along Winsford Park. But this became the kind of center and the heart of the complex. That alone started to shift the thinking around the museum, that gesture, so that some of the initial planning in the museum started to change as a result of Vladimir's work on the garden. But there was a desire to kind of create a stronger connection between the prayer hall and the museum. The prayer hall is aligned with Mecca on that, I think it's southeast. And so these became the kind of principal elements that started to help in the kind of organizing of the buildings. But the greatest impact was really on the museum. Some images of the garden, the size, just some, well, you can read those. Again, some images, but the idea was that there would be five pools that would reflect the 5 acts of Islam, and Vladimir also refers to the 5 senses: taste, touch, smell, and sound. But the 5 acts of Islam, I guess there was the Hajj, the giving alms, meditation, prayer. I forget the 5th one, but I mean the 5 acts that reflect Islam. And the gardens are actually quite beautiful. They're very powerful, and I think they create this kind of sacred space, a sacred space. They create a great space, a great community space that's used quite extensively by the neighborhood. And the neighborhood is actually changing because a lot of the buildings there that used to be, that were offices, are now slowly being changed into kind of residential, both apartments, condominiums. So this area is changing quite dramatically as a result of this complex. So this will become what the Aga Khan wanted, a sort of a gift to the community and for the community to use throughout the year. It's also a sort of an artist palette. I think on the opening day, Imran Qureshi created a kind of a canvas reflecting this kind of opening event, and it was just let the rains wash it away once it was complete. I'm going to talk a bit about the museum. The museum, I think, went through probably the most changes in the course of the design. But this was the hope of the museum was that it would contribute to a better understanding of all the peoples of Islam, the religious, ethnic, linguistic, and social diversity. The museum's educational and cultural mission is to provide visitors with an understanding of the artistic, intellectual, scientific, and religious heritage of the communities, both Muslim and non-Muslims. And that's, here you can see Professor Maki, Gary Kamamoto, His Highness the Aga Khan, our kind of contractual clients, which was a group called Imara Winford Park, an extraordinary group of individuals, Zul Samji, Shamez Mohammed, just a really great group to work with. So the goals and aspirations of the museums was to offer visitors a window into the world's unknown or unfamiliar, the artistic and intellectual and scientific heritage of Muslims, civilizations across the centuries from Liberian Peninsula to China. The museum actually went through 2 iterations. The first iteration came out of the initial master plan. When we were working with the Aga Khan Foundation, developing a program for the museum. And you can see here, these are some of the initial studies of the program. The program was was very simple. It was organized around a courtyard. Organized around this courtyard. There was exhibition spaces, permanent exhibition, temporary exhibitions. It was anchored by an auditorium balcony. And those are the kind of principal spaces, their administration. There's a really kind of strong entrance canopy that stretched out towards Winford Park. Through here, there was a kind of a main stair that went up to the second level. And the second level had the kind of temporary exhibitions that were facing south over Eglinton Avenue. Oh, sorry, that's the main floor. That's the main floor. That's the second floor. Sorry, I had them mixed up. Okay, that's the second floor. So, so the second floor, you can see that it's all exhibitions centered around the agriculture, the courtyard. And there was a strong sort of connection through here to the gardens, which at the time we didn't really know what the gardens were, what those gardens would be, other than that we'd recognize those gardens. Some of the original sketches from the museum, some initial studies. Studies actually had a very kind of, there were kind of closed areas where you had the galleries, and there were very open areas where you had public offices or public use spaces. And some of the initial sketches that show the connection from the courtyard through to the prayer hall of the Ismaili Center. I think then from 2005, when Vladimir Jurich became involved and water started to emerge as sort of a key part of the garden, there was also a time when His Highness and Fumiko Maki talked about what the architectural aspirations of the museum would be. And that's where the focus became on light, that the museum would be not only a source of light in terms of the programs and the education that it would offer to the public, but it would also be a source of light both in its architectural presence along with its operating mission. And that became the direction that really influenced, I think, the final outcome of the form of the museum. The museum actually changed quite dramatically. The actual organization stayed somewhat similar. but the museum shape changed with the kind of walls cantered in and cantered out. There was a series of studies that was done around the central courtyard, which would be the best way. The idea was that the central courtyard, immediately around the perimeter of the central courtyard was the public circulation. The desire was to have that flooded with light, and that light would sort of be a dynamic light that would move around the public spaces throughout the course of the day, throughout the year. So there's a series of studies. We looked at using a kind of a laminated marble or onyx with kind of embedded into a curtain wall system. We looked at operating lures. There was either a combination that they'd be extraordinarily expensive, which meant they were not affordable for the budget, or they were just too complicated and you couldn't get, they're more or less one-off, and we couldn't get the kind of warranties and the kind of risk aversion that you get when you're kind of putting some of these elements together. These are some of the studies of the auditorium was to be a place where there would be music, theater, lectures, symposia, seminars, and it was inspired by some of the Islamic shapes and forms that formed cupolas. In this case, the Zar Kashan in Iran. So there's a series of studies and models that were built of this museum, or sorry, of the theater. There's a series of skylights that we looked at for the galleries that would allow sort of light to filter in for the galleries. And the galleries themselves became, the desire became to have galleries that were not so much black boxes, but places where you could actually look at artifacts in natural light. Black boxes can become, we're kind of wandering around dark galleries, going to where light kind of brings you to. It's actually quite wonderful to look at the artifacts in the galleries of the museum, to see them in natural light, which is how they were conceived and how they were used. But there was also an allowance by introducing a series of soji screens along the base that could kind of close off and allow the galleries to be used if they had to be darkened for a particular light-sensitive exhibition, as well as the skylights, zinc skylights. Also had special screens designed to close off their filtering light if it was required. Again, so I'll just take you now, then I take you to how the museum looks today. Basically from that point in time, we worked very closely with our client group in sort of developing what came out of the museum today. But the direction was really set in 2007 when the decision was made to go with this particular form. The main entrance was shifted. There was a search for the type of stone. There was quite a lengthy search for white stone for the museum. We looked at a kind of a Danby marble. Amongst one of them, we looked at a Danish granite as well. We finally ended up getting a white granite from Brazil, and it was called Margarita White. That was owned, and that was actually owned by a quarry, owned by a company in Italy, Granitex, and we ended up going to Italy to work with them in kind of cutting, dressing, and all the details of how the stone would match with the corners. But it turned out it has a wonderful kind of play of light throughout. It's actually, you can see the kind of reflections that it gets from the water, but also the fact that you also have almost shade and sun and shadow working simultaneously. I think the big change to the museum was it became very, very solid as opposed to the first kind of design that emerged. And they have this sense of a solid piece of stone with deep, deep reveals and recesses that allow the shadow to dominate as it moves around the building. Just a detail of the skylights, the zinc skylights. Again, the interior courtyard. We ended up using a kind of an etched glass on two layers, creating a sort of a three-dimensional shadow pattern that was based on the Islamic mushrabiyya. And that actually worked as an element that moved around. It was in this two-story volume that created the central square. And the main entrance, I think the big thing was that the main entrance had shifted from Winford so that it was now this kind of main entrance off the garden with a link towards the prayer hall. The galleries are really kind of almost galleries that you can use in natural light. They're places to actually sit and contemplate the objects that are there on display. The second floor is a temporary gallery. There's a CISA exhibition on the second floor now. It's actually worthwhile going to. It's great, great exhibition. Fantastic drawings and models. And then the main floor is the permanent gallery. And there's this two-story volume that kind of interconnects at one point in the galleries. Some of the artifacts, some of the light. Adrien Gader from Paris designed the artifacts, designed the exhibitions. He worked with Sana recently, and he's worked with he worked with Jean Nouvel now on the Abu Dhabi Louvre. It's a wonderful way of sort of taking these artifacts and just letting them sit by themselves without kind of jamming museums full of stuff that you have to kind of sort through and find things that you want. It sort of takes you to elements that, working with curators, that they think are important, that you can learn something from, that you can take something away with that. Again, very simple, beautiful display cases holding these actually exquisite artifacts, wonderfully crafted artifacts, with incredible kind of cultural connections between the East and West, and when you look at these symbols. This is really the plan of the museum, very simple. You can see that the big change really from the 2005. It's actually smaller, it was compressed as well. There's a real we worked hard to kind of manage the square footage on it. Again, it's a private museum. You really want to kind of use your square footage well. Museums are expensive to build, they're expensive to run. And so the idea was to keep it very tight, very compact. It's organized around, the spaces are organized around the courtyard. The galleries are this kind of L shape on 2 levels. And then the auditorium is facing towards the prayer hall. This is the major axis towards the prayer hall across the garden. The theater itself has a kind of it's a two-level volume. The staircase takes you up to the 2nd level. It's finished primarily in teak, with the sound baffles behind the teak, these Mushrabia screens. This is all sort of hand plastered, acoustic plaster. It actually took a long time to get it right. It was a source of great frustration for the contractor as a side product, but anyway, it was a lot of work to put into that, and it's a very successful theater. Sort of a detail of one of the zinc Mushrabia screens. The kind of pattern in the courtyard, and just a kind of collage of details. The program itself is very successful. The museums are very kind of dynamic. If I think of, say, the Gardner Museum, which is across from the ROM, which is really downtown, right at the sort of a nexus of major subway lines, the Aga Khan Museum, which is really sort of considered to be out of town by most Torontonians, is actually matched and exceeded the Gardner in its. And the Gardner is a ceramics museum, deals with small objects. Many of the activities here deal with small objects. I think the success of this museum really lies in its outreach, its public programs, its lectures, its music series, its educational series, its outreach. It's a very active outreach. And then there's the Ismaili Center. I'll close on the Ismaili Center because it's a Charles Correa actually passed away, I think about a month after the building opened. He'd worked on this for 16 years, and we knew he was sick. He came to the opening. He hadn't really seen the building for quite a while, and he was quite moved by it. Sort of some details. The building has sort of, I think, 2 major kind of moves. It's got this kind of broad, kind of outreaching arms, and this curved wall, and this giant canopy that sort of reaches out as you kind of come in off of Winford Drive. Very opening, welcoming gesture. And on the kind of south side, facing the Eglinton Parkway, the scale of it's broken down into kind of smaller bits and pieces, more or less to reflect the kind of scale of the kind of communities that are close by it on the other side of the highway. So this side is sort of very formal and welcoming, and the other side is sort of really kind of more dialed into this sort of community program that the Ismaili Center also operates as a major community center for the Ismaili community. Here you can see sort of the prayer hall, sort of main entrance here. Sort of all the scale breaks down on this side. Eglinton Avenue runs on the south side. It's 2 stories. And there's a center space that as you come in, you move into this anteroom and then into the main prayer hall. The prayer hall has a Qibla access here, a clear glass that aligns with Mecca. This is the prayer hall. The prayer hall is actually it was a really sort of major kind of technical challenge in that Charles wanted to have this light that would diffuse the light coming in, as well as in the evening time be very soft as it moved out. So we had to kind of develop the kind of, we worked with Joseph Gardner from Germany. We worked with Intuitive Engineering in designing a kind of a structural system that would allow, here's the Qibla axis here, aligning with Mecca. Lavender here is great, it smells wonderful this time. Here's the kind of prayer hall under construction. But this was the kind of sort of section and mechanical sort of operations of it. There was a couple of issues. One, they wanted to kind of muffle the sound that was coming off the Don Valley Parkway. There was this notion of getting air into this space. It was a big space without pushing it through so that it didn't create a lot of noise, so it had to be sort of displacement ventilation, sort of low velocity pushing it out into the space. And then of course we had to kind of clear the air out through this kind of this sort of plenum between the 2 layers of glass, which was used to control glare as well as control letting light in and letting light out. So it was quite a bit of time working with Charles, working with Nandita Korea, his daughter, who teaches at MIT and came regularly to the site, regularly to the office for coordination meetings, as well as the engineers in sorting this out. And these are some of the details. There's this anteroom that is a kind of a preview as you walk into the prayer hall. The perimeter is sort of maple slats, and the kind of calligraphy that is kind of millwork. The calligraphy millwork says Allah and is repeated as you move around in Arabic. Some of the other spaces. In the Ismaili Center, community spaces, administrative spaces, very successful. There's really only 2 of these Ismaili Centers in Canada. One is in Vancouver and one is in Toronto. And it's a large community in Toronto, so this is used quite actively every day, not only for prayers, but for education, for schooling, for community use and administration. Ariz Hazam, who is also an Ismaili, he was a partner at 2x4 Design, who is now his own design company, with a lot of the interior design work. This is Ariz here. Thought to put this picture in of Charles and Ray. They were actually discovering they both turned 80 that year when they were having this conversation. So they were asking each other what they got for their 80th birthdays. So I think they both got photographs of themselves, I'm not sure. But this final shot is really the opening day of the park, of the complex. Catherine Wynne, Premier, the Aga Khan, the opening, and this was sort of a way, I think, to close this presentation, that the project symbolized integration of the spiritual, the artistic, and the natural worlds, in keeping with the holistic ideal, which is an intimate part of the Islamic tradition. At the same time, they'll express a profound commitment to intercultural engagement and international cooperation. And that's it. Done. Thank you. Oh, okay. Right.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Would anybody like to ask some questions? Can you take some questions? Ian?
Ian.
Good
Thank you.
I feel a bit obliged as the former head of environmental design to maybe frame my question a bit into the context of the program. Because one of the things that some of the objectives of the ES program is different from the OBR was to try and develop an appreciation of the role of architecture. More space,
Right.
all that sort of thing. And a couple of things struck me as you're presenting. First of all, I grew up in that neighborhood where you have the site.
Yeah.
I worked with parking. That whole area where you're building used to be a theme part of the modernist architecture.
That's right. That's right.
So
Yeah.
ortho,
Yep.
pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
the
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Imperial Oil, Don Mill Shopping, et cetera, and go on.
They're all gone, Ian. They're all gone.
All of them,
They're all gone.
Canadian architect, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They're all gone.
Every month
Yeah.
you find something.
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
throw into it. Not all of them.
Yes, they are. Yeah. It's a dilemma for sure. It's a dilemma. Yeah.
And
I think in this case they're replaced with something better. But anyway, go
Toronto,
ahead.
of course, is not the same city.
No, it's not. Toronto's actually changed since I've been there too. It's a
Dramatic.
vastly changed city. Yeah.
But what is your take on that question? I mean, here in my lifetime, I've seen all those buildings designed or destroyed, and then overtaken by this new,
Right. Right.
strong cultural.
I think also, in many cases, some of those buildings were just lost due to the economic realities of developers and institutions that wanted to put other buildings in their place, and oftentimes they were. I mean, in the case, say, of the Bata building, it had been empty for years, and there'd been a number of initiatives to try and find a kind of a raison d'etre for it, and there just wasn't. There was nothing. Because every time there had to be like an economic model to make it sustainable, because and so ultimately, I think Sonia Bata, in her comments, really spoke about the need for if you do replace it with great architecture, with architecture that has a meaning and a sense and a purpose. So I'm not sure the other buildings that you reference are a lot of them are just being replaced by condos and other kind of office facilities. So it's a dilemma, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that dilemma, Ian. I really don't. It's something that I think in practice we face it, and I think it's just something that you try and deal with on a situation by situation basis.
You alluded to it once when you talked briefly about the pushback on that.
Yeah, but it's interesting. The pushback was, it sort of when it sort of became, yeah, okay, well, let's do this, because there really was not much of another solution to it at that point. So, I mean, it engaged a lot of people in trying to decide what was kind of best at that point. So I know it doesn't answer your question, Ian, but I think it's just that Toronto has gone through this wave of development at the same time that's really pushed a lot of these buildings aside, and it continues to do that. The makeup of the city has changed, the density of the city has changed, and the pace of it's changed. So,
I look at things like Canadian architects award winners
yeah,
have a longer lifespan.
so do I. Yeah, so do I. So would I. I would as well, of course. I mean, even I think the example across the street where when Raymond did the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center, which is quite a really beautiful brutalist piece of architecture, that building was saved because we did a house for a gentleman who was who's very wealthy Noor Muslim, who loved Raymond's work. And so he bought that building and he turned it into a cultural center. So he created a kind of an economic model, because the Japanese Canadian community was essentially leaving that building. They were selling it. And it was in an area where there was a lot of condos going up. So he, in fact, that individual, Mr. Ladwani, changed that building, but he kept the kind of essence of it. as a kind of a cultural center. But that was a kind of a combination of somebody with a passion for something and as well as an economic model that made that work. And so it works. And so it was a really interesting exercise to reimagine it as a kind of an Islamic cultural center where the sort of the soji screens became mushrabiyah, and the spaces were subtly modified to reflect another culture that was going to use it as a place to gather. So. Hi, Joanna. Hello.
I was wondering if you had a perspective on how it might be different for the AD grads today than it was when you graduated in 1972. And what would those differences be?
If I have a perspective on how the grads graduating today as
yeah, what would be the differences in terms of opportunity and how is the world different context when you graduated in 1972 and the grads today?
Well, okay, so I'll tell you my feeling about the grads today. I think they're amazing. I teach at the University of Toronto. We have a number of the grads that come through, and I'm always kind of knocked down by the talent. And also the way that there's no boundaries for a lot of the graduates. They'll go work anywhere. They're not kind of, so when I graduated, just moving to Toronto was like a big deal because everybody moved to Vancouver or something. So the kind of sense of the world for graduates is so much greater, and that now we get graduates in our offices from, Europe, from Asia, from Africa, with a sense that what they do is that basically the way we think about our approaches and the work that we do, there's a lot of similarities to it. So I think that the kind of talent that certainly that we see, and probably you see as well, is extraordinary. I think it's extraordinary. The rendering talent, the kind of sort of some of the intellectual sense, sort of some of the commitments to aspects of architecture, some of the passions about it. So yeah, I think it's really quite something. And I just sense that there's a sort of greater, there's perhaps fewer boundaries for them, and more mobility, and I think offices benefit from that. I would hope. I don't know. Does that answer your question, or probably not? Does it? No.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I think we have time for maybe one more. Yes,
anyway,
Lisa?
what I do want to say about education, though, I think the one thing, when I reflect my education here, the one thing that, it was a kind of peripatetic education. It wasn't really a straight line, but I think the thing that we take away from architecture studies is a kind of a sense that we are architects. Somehow, in that transformation of coming in at year one and then leaving at year 7 or whatever, you actually, in that process, either through studio culture or being immersed in design thinking, you actually feel and believe that you are an architect. And I think that that's one of the great things about architecture schools, is that studio culture. The kind of educators and I think they have a profound influence on you that you kind of carry with you, and without necessarily recognizing it, but it's incredible. I think. I can think to my first year here almost. Remember the names of the crits that I had, and it was just like these people had an impact that even today kind of lingers on. So that's part of the process, and I think that's very important. So.
Okay, Lisa? Last question here.
Sure. A quick question. It's a beautiful project. Thank you for bringing it into being. You spoke of it as a transformational project, and clearly it's transformational for the community, for that region of Toronto. I'm curious how it has been a transformational project for your firm. Right. Like how, having worked on a cultural project like this, then reinforces or expands your thinking about the cultural aspects of projects that might not, on the surface, seem to be so loaded.
Right. So we've worked on a few cultural projects. My colleague Carol Phillips worked on the Multi-Faith Center at University of Toronto, where we worked with the anti-racism officer from University of Toronto. We worked with so many different faith-based groups through that process, and I was kind of, I was sort of, wasn't involved, but I was struck at just the kind of consultative process and the kind of way of kind of listening. I think listening is the key to pretty much creating an understanding of well, not only of other groups, but how we need to be able to respond to other groups. I think that I think the success, say, of the Multi-Faith Center, which had, a lot of these groups don't really want to talk to each other, but there's a vibrant, University of Toronto, I don't know if it's same as University of Manitoba, there's a vibrant religious community that's kind of surging through University of Toronto. And we tend to think that we're secular, but we're not. And that religion actually defines something for us in ways that, that secularism doesn't. So, and it's something that has kind of emerged through, I don't know, maybe in the world in the last 10 or 15 years. But there's a tremendous kind of sense of that, certainly when I kind of cut through the university going to my classes. But yeah, so I think listening, understanding, patience, willingness, I think these are all kind of key, almost like key fundamental communication issues that we take in our relationships to each other and to our clients and to the work that we do. So I think in a way that's really kind of made it transformational. I was actually, I was watching some of the Aga Khan gave a presentation on, actually it's worthwhile listening, it's called the Jodidi Lectures at Harvard University. And he was talking about pluralism. Pluralism is actually an interesting way of thinking about life, and the Global Center for Pluralism will, I think, address that. But I think it was the first time of actually seeing him tired and exhausted, and I think because it's pretty clear that the world is in a place these days where we're not listening to each other a whole bunch, and nobody really wants to. So in a way, I think these are the important things that this project will do. I mean, the fact that you can take school kids through the museum on an educational, and that it becomes something that they learn and understand and they can see. I mean, you look at the artifacts, saw strong similarities to artifacts that we're familiar with studying history and the texts and the script, the script, the writing, everything is quite beautiful. So, and the idea is that you try and find the things that kind of bind us together, that make us kind of more relate to each other in a more common and universal way. So I think that's maybe how it's changed us, and sort of that project gave us that kind of opportunity to do that. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thank you for an incredibly interesting presentation this evening, and I think an excellent kickoff to this celebration of 50 years of environmental studies and environmental design. I'm told that earlier in the evening I inadvertently called it environmental science. Did I do that? Everybody knows that I did that. Everybody knew that it's wrong, and I know it's wrong too, but my notes say environmental studies. I'll blame it on glasses, but anyway, I apologize for that. So, thank you to everybody for coming this evening. This ends the formal part of our evening, but that doesn't necessarily mean the evening has ended. I mentioned the mid-century ball that the students have organized for after this event, so please don't hesitate to find some students, get some tickets, and join them for that. Remember that as this is the homecoming for the University of Manitoba, as all of you are graduates of the Faculty of Architecture, that means you are not strangers in this building. Please treat this as your home away from home or your second home or whatever you like to look at it. You're always welcome in this building, and I know I see many of you in here very frequently, but others much less frequently, so please take the invitation to come and see us and find out what the students are up to. If you feel so inclined, please do take one of the donor cards and help us establish that 50th anniversary scholarship. I'm sure that students going forward in the future will be very grateful for your support. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't thank this evening the two people that have really done all the heavy lifting to make this evening a success, Brandy O'Reilly and Leanne Lazar. Please stand up and give us a wave at the back. They took care of countless details to make this evening a success, and I might ask them to put that slide back up with the 3,016 names of all the graduates from the Environmental Studies and Environmental Design program over the year, so that you can find your name on there. And if we have actually missed a name, please let us know, and we'll make a correction. Thanks again for coming. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.